Elden Ring does not hide what it is from the people willing to look, but there is a particular category of darkness inside this game that the lore community has spent years circling without ever quite finding the center of. These are not the mysteries that resolve themselves after a few hours of careful reading. They are the ones that stay open, the ones where the evidence points in a direction without arriving at a destination, where the most careful researchers have built their best arguments and still found themselves standing in front of something that will not quite come into focus. That quality is what drew me to them. And if you find yourself wanting to come back to this kind of material again, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I want to say something briefly about how this video was put together, because I think it matters for what you are about to hear. There are dozens of cases in Elden Ring that get labelled unsolved, and when I started pulling them together, I found myself making a cut that felt significant. I left out the mysteries where the community has effectively converged on an answer, even if that answer is not officially confirmed. What stayed in are the cases where smart, careful people have looked at the same evidence and arrived at genuinely different readings. That distinction guided every choice I made about what belonged here and what did not. The cases in this video are organised the way I came to understand them while I was researching, which is not always the order they appear in the game. Some of them are connected in ways that only became clear to me late in the process. I have tried to preserve that sequence because I think it is the most honest way to present the material, and because arriving at the connections the slow way tends to make them mean more. Chapter 1. The woman in the Liurnia painting there is a painting in Liurnia of the Lakes that most players walk past without stopping. It hangs in one of the ruined structures that scatter the eastern edge of the region, unassuming in the way most environmental details in Elden Ring are unassuming, waiting to be noticed rather than announcing itself. The painting depicts a woman standing at the edge of water. She is not named. The item description does not say who she is, and yet the lore community has been arguing about her identity for years, in a way that reveals something interesting about how Elden Ring hides information, and what it expects players to do with incomplete evidence. The painting itself is described as a work of the Carian school, which places it within the broader artistic tradition associated with the Carian royals and their court at Raya Lucaria. This matters because the Carian school of painting was not purely aesthetic. Works produced in that tradition often carried encoded meaning, political or theological content wrapped inside apparently decorative objects. The question of what this particular painting encodes is the question that has driven the most sustained debate. One reading of the painting connects the woman to Queen Renala herself. The figure stands near water, and Renala's relationship with the Liurnian lake is well established. She retreated there after the Elden Ring was shattered, and her grief over Radagon's abandonment manifested in the amber eggs she cradles throughout the player's encounter with her. Water, in Carian iconography, tends to represent the full moon, which is Renala's domain. A woman standing at the edge of still water would fit that symbolic register without difficulty. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the figure's posture and notice that she is not facing the water. She is standing at its edge, but turned slightly away, which in Carian artistic convention often signals a figure caught between two states rather than fully committed to either one. This is not a conclusive reading. It is a detail that resists the obvious interpretation of the scene. The case against Renala is not built on a single counter-argument, but on an accumulation of smaller doubts. If the painting depicted the Queen, it would almost certainly have been in the Raya Lucaria archives, or in the possession of a Carian noble family. Its placement in a structure that shows no clear affiliation with the Carian court suggests it may have been moved, hidden, or placed there deliberately by someone who wanted it overlooked. That context changes the meaning of the work even before the figure's identity is established. A second theory identifies the woman as Luna Princess Rani, which in some ways is the more complicated reading precisely because it is the more tempting one. Ranni is Renala's daughter. She is connected to the moon in her own right, though in a different mode than her mother. Where Renala's relationship with the full moon is devotional and maternal, Ranni's alignment is with the dark moon, the one that appears in the night sky as absence rather than presence. A figure standing at water's edge with her face turned away from what the water reflects would fit Ranni's iconography better than Renala's. What makes this theory harder to dismiss is the evidence embedded in Ranni's questline. When the player follows her story to its end, they are taken to a chamber deep in the eternal city of Noxtella, where a treasure has been kept for Ranni across uncounted years. The treasure is a ring. And the chamber where it rests is described in terms that echo the composition of the painting in specific ways. Water below, darkness above, a figure expected but not yet arrived. The painting may not be a portrait at all. It may be a scene from a story the game tells in scattered fragments across half a dozen different locations. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the frame of the painting and notice that the wood has been carved with a symbol that also appears on the exterior of Renna's rise, the tower Ranni directs the player toward in the earliest stage of her questline. The symbol is not explained in either context. It appears in both places, and the game leaves the connection for the player to make or not make. The third theory, and the one that has attracted the least attention, despite being in some ways the most disturbing, is that the woman in the painting is neither Renala nor Ranni, but someone else entirely. A figure who does not appear in the game at all, or who appears only in absence. Elden Ring is a world full of people who are mentioned but never shown, who shaped the history of the lands between before the events the player witnesses, and who exist now only as names in item descriptions or as ghosts in the architecture of places they once lived. The woman in the painting might be one of these people. She might be a figure whose story has been edited out of the game's accessible history for reasons that are themselves meaningful. This reading is the most difficult to argue for, and the most difficult to dismiss. It cannot be confirmed, because confirmation would require evidence that by definition does not exist if the character has been deliberately removed from the record. But the painting's placement, its ambiguity, and the specific ways its symbolism refuses to align cleanly with either Renala or Ranni all point toward the possibility that it is depicting something the game does not want to explain. The Carrion School's practice of encoded meaning adds another layer to this problem. If the painting is deliberately obscure, it may be obscure in the way that court art is obscure, which is to say that its intended audience already knew what it was depicting and did not need the identification made explicit. The obscurity would have been legible to contemporaries and has become genuine mystery only from the outside, from the perspective of people looking back at a culture they cannot fully access. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the medium of the painting itself and notice that it is not painted on canvas or wood, but on material that is described, in the item text, in terms associated with preserved skin. This is not unusual in the lands between, where the boundary between human bodies and the materials used to record or create things is consistently unsettled, but it shifts the emotional register of the object. Something is preserved in this painting in a way that goes beyond artistic record. The question of why the painting was made matters as much as the question of who it depicts. Court art in the Carrion tradition served several purposes simultaneously. It documented, it honoured, it encoded political claims in visual form. And in at least some cases, according to item descriptions scattered across Raya Lucaria, it also imprisoned. Certain Carrion artworks are described as containing the consciousness of their subjects, not as a metaphor for how art preserves identity, but as a literal description of a magical process whereby a living person's awareness was transferred into a created object. If the woman in the painting is imprisoned inside it in this sense, then the question of her identity becomes urgent in a different way. Whoever she is, she may still be there. The painting may not be a record of someone who lived and died before the events of the game. It may be a container. And the fact that it sits in a crumbling structure at the edge of Liurnia, unguarded and unremarked, suggests that either no one knows she is there, or no one has decided she is worth releasing. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the player's interaction with the painting, and notice that unlike most environmental objects in Elden Ring, this one does not yield an item on inspection. It cannot be destroyed, it cannot be moved. The player can look at it and read its description, and then walk away. This is not unusual for decorative objects, but it is unusual for objects that carry this density of symbolic detail. The game typically rewards the effort of close attention with something tangible. Here it withholds. The withholding might be the point. Elden Ring is a game that treats absence as information, and the painting's refusal to yield anything except its description and its image is itself a kind of statement. Whatever the woman inside it means, the game has decided that meaning will not be extracted, it will only be looked at. This puts the player in the same position as the woman in the painting, standing at the edge of something and unable to cross into it. The observation is not a metaphor I am reaching for. It is the structure of the encounter. You find the painting. You look at it. You cannot do anything with what you have found. The game has given you a mystery and then declined to participate in its resolution. Whether or not the woman is Renala or Rani or someone else entirely, the painting represents one of Elden Ring's cleaner examples of deliberate ambiguity. The developers made choices about what information to include in the item description and what to leave out, and those choices were made by people who understood the game's lore well enough to know what the ambiguity would produce in the player's mind. The uncertainty is authored. It is not a gap. It is the shape of the thing. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the spatial relationship between the painting's location and the position of the full moon in the night sky as rendered in the game. And notice that on the night cycle, when the moon is at its highest, its light falls through the structure's ruined ceiling and lands on the painting directly. This is either a coincidence of the game's lighting engine, or it is something the developers placed intentionally, and deciding which requires a tolerance for the possibility that the answer is both. The painting has generated a secondary argument about artistic authenticity that has nothing to do with the woman's identity. Some researchers have argued that the work is not genuinely from the Carian school at all, that it is a later forgery or a copy made by someone who had access to Carian visual conventions without fully understanding their symbolic grammar. The evidence for this reading is in small inconsistencies in the encoded symbols, places where the meaning is slightly off, in the way a copied phrase in a language you do not speak is slightly off, grammatically correct but tonally wrong. If the painting is a forgery, then the question becomes who forged it and why. Forgeries in the lands between are not primarily financial frauds. They are more often acts of erasure, ways of replacing a true record with a controlled one. A forged Carian painting depicting a woman near water would be a way of ensuring that the genuine image of whoever that woman was could not be found, because the forgery had displaced it in the locations where the real work might have been kept. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the history of the structure where the painting is housed, and notice that it shows signs of having been systematically emptied, not ruined by the passage of time or the violence that damaged so much of Liurnia, but deliberately cleared, with empty mounting hardware still visible on the walls where other objects once hung. Someone removed things from this place. The painting either escaped their attention or was left behind on purpose. The disturbing quality of the Liurnia painting case is not the supernatural element, which is present but not dominant. It is the quality of the ambiguity itself. The game has built a situation where multiple careful and intelligent readings of the same evidence arrive at different conclusions, and where the act of choosing between them requires the reader to make assumptions that the game refuses to validate. This is not a puzzle with a hidden solution. It is a situation that has no solution accessible from the outside. Whatever the woman in the painting was, she has been kept. That quality of being kept, preserved against decay in a material that should not preserve things, held in a form that cannot be interacted with or released, watching from a fixed point as the world around her continues to change, is the quality that makes this case worth sitting with. The mystery of her identity is real, but the fact of her situation is the thing the painting actually shows you, regardless of who she is. The game does not tell you her name. It does not tell you how she came to be there. It places you in front of her and waits. The discomfort this produces is not incidental. It is the painting doing its work. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the timing of the painting's appearance in the game's development history, and notice that early promotional materials for Elden Ring included a reference to a carrion figure who was later removed from the final release, whose name appears only in archived promotional text, and whose visual design, from the limited preview footage that showed her, shares certain compositional elements with the figure in the painting. Whether this is the same character translated into a different form, or a coincidence born of working within a consistent visual tradition, is impossible to say with certainty. But it is the kind of detail that makes the forgery theory feel less like an academic exercise. The simplest version of this case is still unresolved. A painting exists in Liurnia. It depicts a woman near water. The game does not say who she is. Everything else that has been built around it, the identity theories, the forgery argument, the imprisonment reading, the connection to removed characters, is an attempt to make meaning out of something the game decided not to explain. What it actually is, stripped to its frame, is an image of someone standing at the edge of something, preserved in material that should not preserve things, in a place that was emptied of everything else. That image has been there since the game launched. It will continue to be there. The woman in it will continue to face slightly away from the water. The meaning of that gesture will continue to be uncertain, and the people who have spent years trying to resolve it will continue to find that the painting withholds more than it gives, which is, in the end, exactly the kind of object a carrion artist trained in the encoding of political secrets would have known how to make. The discomfort at the centre of this case is not the possibility that someone is imprisoned inside a painting. It is the possibility that the game built that discomfort deliberately and gave it no exit. The mystery is the point. The mystery has always been the point. And the woman stands at the edge of her water and waits for someone who may never come, in a language that may no longer have any speakers left to read it. That is where this case rests, not at a conclusion, but at an edge. Which is, of course, where the painting places her. There is a version of this story where the woman in the painting chose to be there, where the preservation is not imprisonment, but sanctuary, a decision made by someone who understood what was coming for the lands between, and wanted to survive it in the only form that seemed likely to outlast the violence. This reading is not more or less supported by the evidence than the others. It is simply the one where her situation is a solution rather than a problem. It deserves to be held alongside the darker interpretations rather than dismissed. The Carrion Court had practitioners who understood how to move consciousness between containers. This is established elsewhere in the game's lore with enough specificity that it cannot be written off as vague magic. The technique existed. It was used. The question of who used it and under what circumstances points back toward the painting and toward the figure inside it in ways that keep the case open no matter how many times it seems to resolve. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the player's own relationship to this kind of preservation in the broader context of the game, and notice that the tarnished is themselves a form of preserved consciousness, returned from death by the grace of the Erdtree, held in a body that should have been released from service long ago. The woman in the painting and the player walking past her may be closer to the same thing than either of them appears to be. The word disturbing, which this video uses to describe these cases, applies to the Liurnia painting in a specific way. It is not disturbing because something violent happened near it, though something violent happened everywhere in the lands between. It is disturbing because it represents a kind of permanence that sits outside the game's normal relationship with death and continuation. Most things in Elden Ring are waiting to be resolved, waiting for the Elden Ring to be remade, or the Erdtree to fall, or the age to change. The woman in the painting is not waiting in that sense. She is simply held. The ages can change around her. She will remain exactly as she is. If that is imprisonment, it is the cleanest imprisonment in the game. If it is sanctuary, it is the loneliest. The painting offers no way to know which, and nothing in the game changes the nature of that uncertainty. She stands at the edge of her painted water, slightly turned away, and the case remains exactly where it has always been, open and unresolved and oddly complete in its incompleteness. That is what the painting does. That is what it has always done. And that, for now, is where we leave her. The painters of the Carian school were not purely artists. Several item descriptions across the region describe them also as archivists, people responsible for maintaining a form of institutional memory that went beyond what written records could preserve. Paintings in their tradition were sometimes the only surviving record of people and events that had been deliberately struck from written history. The woman in the Liurnia painting may belong to this category, a person whose name was removed from the texts and whose image survived only because it was hidden in a place where whoever did the removing did not think to look. That would make the painting a form of evidence in a crime that took place long before the events of the game, and the crime would be a particular kind, not murder or theft, but erasure, the systematic removal of someone from the record in a way that was designed to make her absence unnoticed. She is not a missing person in the game's history. She is a person whose absence was manufactured. The painting survived because someone hid it, or because the people doing the removing were less thorough than they intended to be. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the decorative border of the painting's frame more carefully, and notice a sequence of markings that scholars of Carian visual language have identified as a notation system used to mark works that were intended to be found only by specific people, a kind of visual password that would have been legible only to initiates. The painting was not hidden from everyone. It was hidden from particular people. Someone expected that particular other people would find it. The question of who the intended finder was, and whether they ever came, is another thread the case leaves dangling. Whatever the painting was made for, it has ended up in a place where anyone can find it, but no one can read it fully. The Carian initiates, who would have known how to interpret its visual language, are gone. The systems of meaning they carried have been lost with them, or dispersed into the kind of partial survival where fragments remain, but the grammar that held them together is gone. The painting is legible as an image and illegible as a message. That condition describes a lot of what Elden Ring has preserved from the world before the shattering. The case of the woman in the Liurnia painting is, in miniature, the case of the lands between itself. Things survived. Their meaning did not always survive with them, and the work of understanding what you are looking at requires piecing together a grammar from evidence that was never organised for the purpose of being pieced together. The painting sits in its ruined shelter and holds its painted woman and declines to explain itself. This is not a failure of the game's storytelling. It is the game's storytelling doing exactly what it was designed to do. The most honest thing that can be said about the Liurnia painting at this stage in the research is that it has resisted every attempt to close it. Not because the evidence is thin, but because the evidence is rich enough to support multiple readings simultaneously, and specific enough that none of those readings can be cleanly eliminated. This is a different kind of unresolved from the cases where nobody has looked carefully enough yet. The careful looking has been done. The case is still open. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how other preserved figures in the lands between are treated by the people around them and notice that they are rarely acknowledged directly. The preserved are spoken around, rather than about. This is true of Renala in her library, surrounded by students who have long since given up on leaving. It is true of Morgoth on his throne. The woman in the painting exists in this same register of acknowledged but unnamed presence, a thing that everyone who passes through that ruined structure can see, and that no surviving voice in the game has chosen to describe. She is a secret that has been hiding in plain view since the world changed around her. Whether that is her design or someone else's, whether she is waiting or simply held, whether the water in her painting is the Liurnian lake or something older, the painting does not say. It shows her, it holds her, and it goes on not explaining, the way certain kinds of truth do when they have been waiting long enough to stop needing to announce themselves. That quality of plain visibility combined with genuine obscurity is the last thing worth noting about this case before moving to the next one. The painting is not buried, it is not encrypted, it does not require a particular questline to find. Anyone who walks through Liurnia and turns into that structure will see it. The mystery is not protected by access, it is protected by the fact that seeing it and understanding it are different things, and the gap between them is where the woman has been living, quietly and without explanation, since the day the game was made. Chapter 3. What happened to the Glow-Eyed Queen? The Glow-Eyed Queen is one of the most consequential figures in Elden Ring's history who never appears in the game. She is referenced in item descriptions associated with the Black Flame incantations, with Malekith, and with the Rune of Death, and those references sketch a picture of someone who was powerful enough to threaten the Golden Order, and who was defeated by Malekith before the events of the main game. What they do not sketch is who she was, what she wanted, what happened to her body or her soul after her defeat, or why she had the particular power she had. The Glow-Eyed Queen existed. She was removed. The game tells you this much, and nothing more. The power she wielded was the Black Flame, which is described in the game as a fire that burns away the divine. Most fires in Elden Ring cause damage that can be recovered from through various forms of regeneration. The Black Flame is specifically described as causing wounds that continue to reduce the maximum health of what they burn. It does not destroy. It reduces. The divine essence that sustains gods and demigods and Golden Order entities is precisely what the Black Flame targets. A fire specifically designed to burn away divinity is a profoundly specific tool, and the Glow-Eyed Queen is the person who had it. One possible reading of this is that the Glow-Eyed Queen was not simply an enemy of the Golden Order, but a natural counter to it. The Golden Order, built around the Erd Tree in the Elden Ring, runs on a kind of sacred fire and sacred life. The Black Flame is its specific antidote. Whether the Queen developed this power herself, or inherited it from something older, and whether she intended it as a weapon, or discovered it as a property of something she already possessed, is not answered by the game's available evidence. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the item description for the ancient Death Rancor incantation, and notice that its text associates certain kinds of deathfire with a period before the current age, a time when the concepts of death and divine flame were not yet separated into the distinct systems the Golden Order later formalized. The Black Flame may be a relic of that prior period, a fire that existed before the Erd Tree drew the boundary between sacred and profane flame. If so, the Glow-Eyed Queen was not wielding a weapon she invented. She was wielding something that had been in the world before the current order was imposed. The relationship between the Glow-Eyed Queen and the Rune of Death is one of the case's more contested areas. The Rune of Death is the portion of the Elden Ring that governs mortality, the force that was removed from the Elden Ring by Marika and stored outside it, eventually ending up in Malekith's body, where it could be kept controlled. Some researchers have argued that the Glow-Eyed Queen had specific access to or control over the Rune of Death before Marika moved to suppress it, which would mean her defeat was part of the same project as the removal of the Rune of Death from the Elden Ring, a systematic effort to bring mortality under the Golden Order's management. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Black Flame monks who serve as enemies in the game and notice that they have not forgotten the Gloam-eyed Queen. They continue to practice the Black Flame incantations. They continue to operate in the specific locations associated with the gloam, the hour of twilight between day and night that is the Queen's symbolic domain. They have been practicing a defeated tradition for an unspecified period of time, without any living figure to report to, or any organisational structure that would explain their continued coherence as a group. The faith has outlasted the Queen. This is either testimony to her power as a figure, or testimony to the depth of the current Order's failure to fully extinguish what she represented. If the Black Flame monks are continuing a practice the Golden Order officially ended, they represent a form of resistance so quiet it has become invisible. They are not fighting, they are simply maintaining. Keeping the incantations alive in bodies that will eventually die and be replaced by other bodies that will learn them. This is the most patient form of opposition available to people who have lost decisively. They are not trying to win, they are trying to remember. The question of what happened to the Gloam-eyed Queen after Malekith defeated her has several candidate answers, none fully supported. The most straightforward is that she died in the conventional sense, that Malekith killed her and her consciousness was dispersed. This is consistent with the lack of any surviving presence or influence she seems to exert on the game's events, but it sits uneasily with the fact that her followers survived in organised form, and that her specific power, the Black Flame, is still being practiced and can still be wielded. Another quiet detail appears when you look at Malekith's own character and notice that he is not described anywhere in the game as someone who defeats enemies and moves on. He is described as a sealer, as someone whose function is specifically to prevent certain things from re-entering the world once they have been contained. His role is not execution, but imprisonment. This does not prove the Gloam-eyed Queen is imprisoned somewhere rather than dead, but it suggests that Malekith's defeat of her may have produced a containment rather than a destruction, and that somewhere in the lands between there is a sealed space that holds whatever she became after the Black Flame monks lost their queen. The Gloam-eyed Queen case is disturbing in a way that is partly about the absence itself. Someone powerful enough to threaten the entire Golden Order was removed from the world, and the removal was so complete that she left almost nothing behind except the fire she wielded and the people who practice it. The completeness of the erasure is its own form of evidence. Accidental or natural obliteration tends to leave more fragments. Deliberate erasure of this quality requires effort and intention and sustained maintenance to prevent the erased thing from reasserting itself in the record. The Golden Order has been maintaining the erasure of the Gloam-eyed Queen for a very long time. The maintenance is still ongoing, which you can infer from the fact that the Black Flame monks are not in the game's historical record, but in its active present. They are still being opposed, still being killed, still existing in the game's world as enemies the player encounters. Someone is still fighting the residue of the Gloam-eyed Queen's tradition. The tradition is still alive enough to require fighting. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the timing of the Gloam-eyed Queen's defeat in relation to the other major events in the Lands Between's history, and notice that her removal happened close in time to Marika's removal of the Rune of Death from the Elden Ring. These two events, the containment of the Queen and the extraction of the Rune of Death, are positioned in the timeline in ways that suggest they were part of a single campaign rather than separate decisions. Something was happening to the Lands Between's relationship with death during that period, a systematic effort to bring mortality under divine management, and the Gloam-eyed Queen was either an obstacle to that effort or a casualty of it. If she was an obstacle, then she had a specific position on how death should work in the Lands Between, and that position was in conflict with Marika's project. If she was a casualty, She may simply have been in the wrong place, a powerful figure whose power was too close to the rune of death for the Golden Order to leave uncontrolled. The distinction between obstacle and casualty matters for how you interpret her followers' ongoing practice. Obstacles leave philosophical legacies. Casualties leave grief. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the visual design of the Black Flame and notice that unlike most Golden Order-affiliated flames, which have a warm, luminous quality consistent with the Erd Tree's golden light, the Black Flame is cool and dark, and specifically described as having a quality of dusk in its appearance. Dusk is the gloam. The visual design of the power is encoded with the Queen's identity in a way that suggests whoever designed the Black Flame understood it as inseparable from the person who first wielded it. The power is not generic. It is personal. It carries her in it every time someone uses it. The Black Flame monks, when they cast their incantations, are in some sense invoking her. Whether or not they understand it this way, whether or not the game's lore supports the reading that using her power is a form of relationship with her, the visual and thematic encoding of her identity in the flame means that her presence persists in every instance of its use. She may be the most distributed figure in the game, present in no single location, and yet present everywhere the Black Flame burns. The mystery of what happened to the gloam-eyed Queen is also, less obviously, the mystery of what she wanted. Her power is specific. Her domain is specific. The gloam is the specific hour of transition between light and dark, between day and night. This is not a metaphor for chaos or destruction. It is a metaphor for change, for the moment when one state becomes another, for the boundary condition between opposed things. A queen who ruled the gloam and wielded a fire that reduced divine essence was a figure positioned at the edge of the Golden Order rather than outside it entirely. She was not anti-divine in any simple sense. She was the condition of transition between states, and transition was exactly what the Golden Order most needed to control. What the Golden Order needed from mortality was for it to be a managed transition, controllable, applicable to the right things at the right times, removed from anything that might apply it to the Erd Tree or to the gods themselves. The gloam-eyed Queen represented unmanaged transition, death that did not check its targets against a list of the divine and the excluded. In that sense, her defeat was not about what she was doing, but about what she could do. She was removed not for having burned the Erd Tree, but for being the person who could. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the nature of preemptive removal in the Lands Between's history, and notice that it is a consistent feature of how the Golden Order has operated. The gods did not wait for threats to actualize. They addressed the capacity for threat. The gloam-eyed Queen, the rune of death, the frenzied flame, the ancient dragons, all of these were not defeated or contained after they committed some specific act of war against the Golden Order. They were removed because they represented conditions that the Golden Order had decided it could not coexist with. The Queen may never have tried to burn a god. She simply had the fire that could. The case of the gloam-eyed Queen is, at its core, the case of a person defined entirely by what was done to her rather than by anything recorded of what she did or intended. She is a shape drawn in negative space, outlined by the actions taken against her and the residue those actions left behind. We know she was powerful because of how carefully her power was managed after her defeat. We know she was threatening because of the scale of the response to her. We know she was real because she left followers who are still practicing her tradition in the game's present. What we do not know is her name, her face, her words, her intentions, or the nature of whatever she was trying to do or protect or preserve. She is the most erased person in Elden Ring. And the erasure is so complete, so sustained, so actively maintained, that it functions as a kind of testimony to what she was. You do not need this much effort to keep a small thing gone. The size of the ongoing suppression tells you the size of the thing being suppressed. The gloam-eyed queen was large. Whatever she was large enough that the Golden Order decided it needed a name for the hour she ruled and a word for the fire she carried, and then decided that both of those needed to be kept small and controlled and contained, so that the thing that had wielded them could not come back through the door the practice left open. That door is still there, in the black flame monks, in the incantations still being practiced, in the dusk quality of the fire when it burns. The queen is gone. Her door is still open. And nobody has yet been able to say with certainty what is on the other side of it. Chapter 4. The purpose of the Eternal Cities. The Eternal Cities are among the most mysterious locations in Elden Ring, and among the least discussed relative to how much they contain. Nokron and Nokstella exist beneath the lands between, at a depth that situates them outside the Erdtree's grace, outside the normal operation of the Golden Order, and outside most of the events that shaped the surface world. They have their own starlight, their own architecture, their own population of beings who were living there before and after everything that happened above them. They are not ruins in the usual Elden Ring sense. They feel less like places that were destroyed and more like places that were left behind. The most commonly accepted reading of the Eternal Cities is that they were the capitals of the Nox civilization, a people who attempted to summon an outer god called the Formless Mother and were cast underground by the Greater Will as punishment for the attempt. This reading is supported by item descriptions associated with Nox warriors and by the general organization of what can be found in the cities. But it leaves the most interesting questions about the Eternal Cities unaddressed, because the most interesting questions are not about what the Nox did, but about what they built and what that building was for. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the astronomical equipment throughout Nokron and Nokstella and notice that it is not decorative. The cities are full of devices for observing celestial bodies from below the earth, which is a remarkable engineering project for a civilization that was allegedly punished by being prevented from ever seeing the sky again. The Nox built instruments for looking at stars from inside a world where stars are inaccessible. Whether this is defiance, grief, or something more functional is not established by the available evidence. The star-gazing apparatus in the Eternal Cities has generated a significant thread of research around the question of what the Nox were actually looking at. The devices are pointed at specific coordinates that, when translated to surface positions, correspond to locations that are significant in other parts of the game's lore. They were not simply maintaining a general practice of astronomical observation. They were watching specific places. This suggests the Eternal Cities were in active communication with, or at least active monitoring of, something on the surface or beyond the surface, long after they were sealed underground. One possible reading of this is that the Nox were continuing the project that got them cast underground. Their attempt to summon the Formless Mother was an astronomical project of a kind, a reaching towards something beyond the world through techniques that involved celestial alignment. Being sealed underground would not necessarily have ended that project if the required alignments could still be calculated from below. The Nox may have been working on the summoning for their entire underground existence, without the surface access they had before, using instruments designed to compensate for the loss. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the mimic tear, one of the most disturbing creatures in the Nokron area, and notice that it is explicitly described as an entity created by the Nox in an attempt to create life. The Nox were working on the creation of artificial beings alongside whatever astronomical project they were running. The combination of these two activities, summoning an outer god and creating artificial life, suggests a civilization working on multiple large-scale projects simultaneously, with resources and knowledge sufficient to pursue both. The mimic tear specifically replicates the forms it encounters, which is a deeply unsettling capacity if you spend any time with its implications. It does not copy in a static sense. It copies dynamically, adjusting its form based on what it perceives. This is either a failed attempt at genuine life creation, where the Nox tried to make a being that could be any person and ended up making a being that could be every person serially, or it is a successful attempt to create something specific, and the thing it was designed to be is a functional copy of a target that the Nox had in mind before the copy encountered the player. The identity of the original target of the mimic tear design is a question nobody has answered satisfactorily. The Nox were underground and sealed away from the surface. The people they would have had access to as models are limited, but the mimic tear's adaptive capacity suggests it was not designed for a static target. It was designed to encounter its target and then become it. The encounter was supposed to happen. Whatever the Nox were planning to send a mimic tear after, they intended the tear to find it, rather than to have it described in advance. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Fingerslayer blade found in Nokron, and notice that it is described as a weapon capable of wounding the two fingers, the physical manifestation of the Greater Will's guidance in the lands between. A weapon designed to hurt the messengers of the god who cast the Nox underground was not made in anger. Making such a weapon requires knowledge of what the two fingers are vulnerable to, which requires sustained study of their nature, which requires a civilization that spent its underground existence developing the specific technical knowledge needed to strike at the entity responsible for their punishment. The Fingerslayer blade is one of the most explicitly revolutionary objects in Elden Ring. It is a weapon made by a civilization sealed underground by a god for the specific purpose of being used against that god's representatives. The fact that it was then kept in Nokron, apparently unused for a very long time, rather than brought to the surface and deployed, suggests either that the Nox never found the opportunity to use it, or that they made it and then reconsidered, or that it was made not for use but as proof of concept, as evidence that the technology to wound the two fingers was achievable. If it was proof of concept, then the Eternal Cities were running a weapons development program alongside their astronomical observation and their life creation experiments. They were a civilization that had been punished for reaching toward a particular outer god and spent their underground years developing multiple simultaneous projects aimed at either completing that original reach or preparing for a war with the entity that stopped them. This is not the picture of a culture destroyed by their transgression. It is the picture of a culture that absorbed the destruction and kept working. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Nox civilians, the non-warrior inhabitants of the Eternal Cities who still wander the ruins. And notice that they are described not as people who died when the cities fell, but as people who are still alive in some technical sense, preserved in a state of ongoing existence by the same absence of the rune of death that applies to Tarnished. The Eternal Cities are outside the Erd Tree's grace, but they are also outside the normal operation of mortality. The Nox who were in the cities when they were sealed may never have died. They may still be there, in the form the game shows them, wandering the streets of cities that have been underground since before the events of the main game. What that means for their experience of the intervening time is something the game presents without explanation. They have not aged. They have not decomposed. They have continued in the form they were in when the cities were sealed. Whether they have continued to experience time, whether they have been awake through the full duration of the city's underground existence, or whether their preservation involved something like suspension, is a question that the items associated with them do not answer. The Eternal Cities case is disturbing, in part because of what it implies about scale. Elden Ring already has an unambiguous relationship with geological time, with events that happen thousands of years before the game's present affecting the present in direct ways. But the Eternal Cities bring that scale into contact with individual human beings in a particularly uncomfortable way. The wandering Nox civilians have been underground for an unspecified but very long time. The experience of that, whatever it has been, is inside them. They are carrying something the game does not describe and cannot easily be described. The architecture around them is the architecture they knew when the punishment began, The starlight above them is the artificial starlight the cities generated for themselves when the real sky was removed. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the ancestral followers, who also inhabit the eternal cities alongside the Nox, and notice that they are not Nox at all. They are a different people with a different tradition, people who follow the antlered figures associated with an older form of death and rebirth that predates the Golden Order. Their presence in the eternal cities is not explained in the item descriptions for either group. They are simply there, coexisting with the Nox, in spaces that are explicitly identified as the underground capitals of the Nox civilization. Whether the ancestral followers were there before the Nox arrived underground, whether the eternal cities were built over pre-existing spaces that the followers already occupied, or whether they arrived after the sealing for reasons of their own, is not established. Their presence in the same space as the Nox creates an overlap that neither culture's descriptions explain. The eternal cities may have been occupied by more than one people, for more than one reason, across a span of time long enough that the original reason for the space has been layered over with subsequent reasons. The full picture of the eternal cities may not be the picture of Nox punishment that the most accessible reading presents. It may be a more complicated picture of a space that existed for one purpose, was given to a punished people, and then became something more complicated as time accumulated inside it. The cities are old enough that they have absorbed more history than any single explanation can contain. The disturbing quality of the case is not the Nox's transgression or their imprisonment, but the sense that the underground has been going on long enough to become something that was never intended, populated by people and creatures and weapons and astronomical instruments and preserved civilians and ancestral followers, all coexisting in a space that was meant to be a cage and has become something closer to a world. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the name Eternal Cities and notice that the name is either ironic or prophetic. Cities are eternal in the Nox tradition, not because they last forever, but because they exist outside the time that other places are subject to. They are not imperishable. They are timeless, which is different. The eternal cities will eventually end like everything else, but they end on a timeline that is not the surface world's timeline. They are running on their own calendar, with their own stars overhead, in a space sealed from the changes that have reshaped everything above them. Whether that is punishment or preservation depends on which side of the seal you are standing on. The case of the eternal cities is the case of a civilization that survived its punishment and kept working. The surface world forgot them. The Golden Order suppressed the memory of what they were and what they attempted. And underground, in the artificial starlight, the instruments kept pointing at the sky they could no longer see, and the weapons kept waiting for a target they had never been deployed against, and the civilians kept walking the streets of cities that had been below the world since before the events of the game began. Whatever the Nox were trying to accomplish, they were not finished when the punishment fell. The evidence of the eternal cities is the evidence of a civilization still mid-project, frozen in the moment of a reaching that was interrupted before it could complete. The cities are a held breath. They are a sentence with the period still to come. Whether the period arrives with the player's descent and the Fingerslayer blade's eventual use, or whether it is still waiting, is a question the game answers only partially. The blade was used. Ranni used it. What it made possible in her story is one of the game's more extraordinary trajectories. But whether that particular use was what the Nox intended when they made it, or whether it was a deviation from a larger plan that has not yet arrived at its final step, is something the Eternal Cities will not say. Chapter 5. The Origin of the Omen. The Omen are one of the most visible populations in Elden Ring, and one of the least understood in terms of what they actually are. They appear throughout the game, most prominently in Mog's dynasty beneath Lurndel, and in the presence of Morgott himself, who rules the city above and is an omen born to Marika and Godfrey. They are identifiable by their horns, which grow from their bodies in varied and sometimes extreme ways, and by their exclusion from the Golden Order's grace, which is formalized enough that there is an organized institution, the Omen Killer Organization, dedicated to hunting and eliminating them. What the Omen are, in a metaphysical sense, is not explained with the directness one might expect for a population this visible in the game's world. The prevailing community understanding is that they are humans cursed by an excess of the same omen that attends the birth of powerful beings in the Elden Ring world. The horns are the physical manifestation of this excess, but the origin of the curse, why it attaches to certain people and not others, and what it actually is in terms of the game's cosmology rather than its biology, has not been resolved. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the distinction between omen who are born to commoners and omen who are born to royalty, and notice that the game treats them in meaningfully different ways. Common omen are hunted and killed. Royal omen, like Morga and Mog, are imprisoned and sealed away rather than destroyed. This differential treatment implies that the Golden Order understood omen royalty to be either more dangerous than common omen or more valuable. Neither explanation has been fully worked out in the research. If royal omen are more dangerous, then Morgo and Mog represent concentrations of the curse's power that exceed what ordinary omen killers could address. This would explain their imprisonment, without fully explaining what the excess power they carry actually is. If they are more valuable, then the curse that afflicts omen has a quality when it manifests in royal bloodlines that the Golden Order wants to preserve or study, which raises questions about what the institutions surrounding the Erdtree were planning to do with what they had imprisoned. The relationship between the omen curse and the outer gods is a thread of research that has developed in parallel with the more straightforward biological readings. The outer gods in Elden Ring are consistently associated with physical mutation, with the development of unusual or extreme physical characteristics in the people they touch. The scarlet rot produces specific changes. The formless mother produces specific changes. The question of whether the omen horns represent the touch of an outer god that is not otherwise named in the game, or whether they represent a malfunction in the Golden Order's own systems, is not answered by the current evidence. Another quiet detail appears when you look at Mog's relationship to the formless mother, the outer god associated with blood. And notice that while Mog is himself an omen, his devotion to the formless mother is described as an addition to his nature rather than an expression of it. He was already omen before he found the formless mother's blessing. The omen curse and the formless mother's influence coexist in him, but appear to be distinct things. This complicates the reading that omen are the product of any particular outer god's influence, because Mog is demonstrably connected to an outer god, and that connection is portrayed as separate from what made him an omen. The question of what the omen curse is trying to produce is one that has received more attention recently. Curses in Elden Ring are not always punishments in a simple sense. Several of the game's curses are better understood as processes, transformations that are taking the person they affect in a specific direction that the curse was designed to produce. The omen horns grow. They are not a fixed malformation, but an ongoing development. The direction they are developing toward is something the game has not shown, because none of the omen in the game have been allowed to develop fully. They are killed or imprisoned before whatever they are becoming can complete. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the most advanced omen you can find in the game, the ones whose horns have grown to extreme lengths, and notice that their body language and behaviour is different from the omen who have fewer or shorter horns. The most heavily developed omen are not more violent. They are more focused. They move with a quality of purpose that the less developed ones do not always have. The development is producing something in their consciousness or their will that is legible in their behaviour, even when it is not described in their item texts. If the omen curse is a process towards something, and if that something produces focused intentionality rather than madness or violence, then the Omen Killer institution takes on a different character. It is not simply managing a dangerous population. It is preventing a population from completing a development that the Golden Order does not want completed. The Omen are not being hunted because of what they are now. They are being hunted because of what they would be if they were allowed to finish. Morgoth's situation clarifies this in ways that are easy to overlook. He is an Omen who has been imprisoned, released, and who now serves the very institution that imprisoned him. He defends Lundel against all comers, including the Tarnished who might remake the Elden Ring. His dedication to the Golden Order is not superficial. He genuinely believes in it, and he is an Omen, the thing the Golden Order hunts and seals. His belief in the Order that would have killed him if his parentage had not given him protected status is either the deepest possible testimony to the Golden Order's ideological power, or it is a more specific condition. Something that was done to Morgoth during his imprisonment that reoriented his relationship to the institution. Another quiet detail appears when you look at Morgoth's dialogue when he is encountered as an enemy, and notice that he speaks about the Tarnished not simply as invaders, but as people pursuing a fantasy. People who believe the Elden Ring can be remade in a way that will solve what needs solving. His objection is not primarily that the Tarnished are an enemy, it is that they are wrong about what the Elden Ring can do. This is the position of someone who has thought carefully about what the Elden Ring is and what it cannot provide, and it is a strange position for a person who is imprisoned by the order the Elden Ring underpins. The disturbing quality of the Omen case is partly about what the game implies about what completeness would look like for someone in Morgoth's position, someone who has been arrested mid-development, prevented from becoming whatever the curse was taking him toward, and who has instead organised his entire existence around serving the institution that arrested him. Whatever Morgoth might have become if the Omen curse had been allowed to complete is not something the game shows. He is the most developed Omen in the game's accessible history, and he is also one of the most explicitly incomplete. His dedication to the Golden Order is, among other things, a form of amnesia about what he was in the process of becoming. The Omen case extends to the broader question of how the Golden Order manages things it does not understand. The Omen are not categorized in any of the Golden Order's accessible theological frameworks as a problem with a known cause. They are categorized as a problem with a known response, which is elimination or containment. The response was systematized before the cause was understood. This is a consistent pattern in how the Golden Order operates. The management of the problem is prioritized over the understanding of it, and the result, in the case of the Omen, is that the Lands Between has been killing or containing people who are in the middle of a transformation for an extended period of time, without ever fully establishing what the transformation would have produced, if allowed to complete. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the locations where Omen congregate outside of the underground spaces dedicated to them, and notice that they tend to cluster near the roots of the Erd Tree, near the places where the tree's power is most directly accessible in physical form. Whether this is deliberate movement toward the Erd Tree's power, or an effect of the same attraction that the roots exert on other things, is not clear. But the geographical relationship between Omen distribution and Erd Tree root location is consistent enough to be a pattern rather than a coincidence, and a pattern that's specific deserves to be taken seriously as evidence of something. If the Omen are drawn toward the Erd Tree's roots, and if the curse they carry is a process taking them towards something specific, then the Erd Tree may be involved in that process in ways that the Golden Order has managed to suppress from the accessible record. The institution that hunts Omen and the institution that maintains the Erd Tree may be the same institution managing a contradiction in its own nature, sending agents to kill people who are drawn toward the very source of the Order's power. The origin of the Omen curse, the identity of whatever produced it, and whatever its intended endpoint is, remains unresolved. The researchers established the pattern of the curse's progression, identified the differential treatment of royal versus common Omen, noted the geographical relationships and behavioural changes that accompany development, and found the Erd Tree connection suggestive but not conclusive. What it has not found is the source, the beginning of the condition, the moment or mechanism or entity that produced the first omen and set the process going. That beginning would explain everything else. Without it, the case is a description of a pattern without an origin, which is the most structurally unsatisfying position for a piece of evidence to be in. The omen are in every corner of the game's world, visible and numerous and specific. Whatever made them has left no accessible record of itself. The curse is real. The curse has a direction. The thing that started the curse toward that direction has been more thoroughly removed from the game's accessible history than almost anything else in the lands between. Chapter 6. The memory of Godwyn the Golden. Godwyn the Golden was the first demigod to die, and the circumstances of his death produced one of the most cosmologically catastrophic events in Elden Ring's history. He was killed by Ranni and the Black Knife assassins in a ritual that used shards of the Rune of Death. But the specific nature of the ritual meant that only his soul died, not his body. His body survived. It continued in the world without a soul, growing and spreading through the ground beneath the lands between, threading itself through the roots of the Erdtree, producing the death-root corruption that has spread through much of the world by the time the player arrives. The case of Godwyn is widely discussed in the lore community, but most of that discussion has focused on the mechanics of what happened to his body, which are fairly well established. The case that remains genuinely open is the case of what Godwyn's experience has been. He has no soul in the conventional sense. He has no consciousness operating in the way that conscious beings have consciousness. And yet his body is demonstrably active. It grows. It spreads. It produces creatures. It interfaces with the world in purposive-looking ways. The question of whether there is any experience happening inside Godwyn's ongoing existence is a question the game raises without answering. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Deathroot locations scattered across the lands between and notice that they are not randomly distributed. They cluster near specific locations that have significance in Godwyn's life as a warrior, as a diplomat, as Marika's beloved son. The routes are not simply following the path of least geological resistance. They are following a path that traces Godwyn's history. Whether this is a property of the bodiless survival instinct, a kind of somatic memory encoded in tissue rather than thought, or whether it represents something more like genuine remembering, something present in Godwyn's bodily existence that functions like recollection even in the absence of a soul, is not established. The theological implications of Godwyn's situation have generated more discussion than most other aspects of his case. The Golden Order teaches that existence has value because it persists within the Erdtree's grace, and that death, when it comes, returns the soul to the Erdtree, where it continues in a different form. Godwyn's situation breaks both sides of this teaching. His soul died without returning to the Erdtree. His body persists without the grace that the Golden Order teaches is required for persistence. He is the most specific possible counterexample to the Golden Order's cosmological system, and his existence, or the existence of his body, is a fact that the Golden Order has had to manage without being able to explain. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the description of the remembrance of the grafted associated with Godric rather than Godwyn, and notice that the language used to describe what a remembrance is suggests that it is not simply a memorial object. It is described as containing the power of the person it commemorates, as being a kind of condensed existence that persists after the person is gone. If remembrances work this way for demigods who died in the conventional sense, then the question of whether Godwyn has a remembrance, and where it might be, and what it would contain given that his situation is unlike any other death in the game, is one that the research has not fully addressed. The more disturbing strand of the Godwyn case is the one that focuses not on what he is now, but on what he was in the moment of the ritual. Ranni's plan involved killing only his soul, which required a specific application of the Rune of Death that separated the soul from the body at the moment of death rather than allowing both to be carried away together. For this to work, Godwyn had to be present for a long enough period in the liminal state between living and not yet dead that the ritual could be completed. The research that has gone into reconstructing what that period might have been like from the inside has arrived at some uncomfortable places. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Black Knife assassins, Ranni's agents who carried out the ritual killing, and notice that they are not described as killing Godwyn quickly. The ritual is described in terms that suggest duration, a process, rather than an event. This means Godwyn experienced the beginning of his soul's death before the process completed. Whatever that experience was, it happened. It was something that occurred to a conscious being in the fullness of his awareness, and the body that survived is the body that was present for it. Whether the body carries any trace of that experience in its ongoing existence is a question nobody has found a way to access. The death route that spreads from Godwyn's body is not described as emotionally coded. It does not carry identifiable affect. But the question of whether something encoded in his tissue from the moment of his soul's departure influences the way his body has moved through the world since then, whether the spreading and the clustering near significant locations is something more than biological, is one that the available evidence cannot dismiss. Fia's relationship to Godwyn is the most tender and the most disturbing element of the case. She came to Godwyn's body specifically to be close to it, to lie with it, to maintain a physical proximity that she describes in terms of care and service, but that has the quality of a grief that has extended beyond its normal span. She is a deathbed companion, which in the game's lore refers to someone who serves specific figures at the moment of their death. Godwyn's moment of death produced a situation that has not ended. His body is still dying, or still surviving, or still in that first moment of the separation stretched across geological time. Fia has stayed with it through all of that. Another quiet detail appears when you look at what Fia actually gains from her proximity to Godwyn's body, and notice that it is described in the game as the accumulation of death's blessing, a concentration of the force associated with death that she then carries in her embrace and can transfer to others. She is collecting the ongoing output of Godwyn's death body and making it portable. Whether this is exploitation or devotion or both simultaneously is a question the game's framing does not answer cleanly. Fia's quest ends with an attempt to use what she has accumulated to perform a different kind of death for Godwyn, to complete something that the original ritual left incomplete. Whether what she is trying to give him is death in the conventional sense, release, or a different form of continuation is not described with the precision that would allow a definitive interpretation. She is trying to do something for Godwyn. What the doing of it would mean for him is ambiguous enough that the gesture is simultaneously among the most compassionate acts in the game and among the most ethically uncertain. The case of Godwyn the Golden is disturbing in the most sustained way of any case in this video, because it is not resolved by his defeat as a boss or by the end of his body spreading. Whatever is happening inside his ongoing existence has not stopped. The death route continues. The body continues. The question of what, if anything, is experiencing that continuation continues with it. He is the game's most explicit confrontation with the possibility that existence without consciousness is not simply neutral. That a body that was once a person, continuing to act in the world without the soul that made it a person, is a situation that has a moral weight that cannot be discharged by calling it biology. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the curse mark of death, the mark left on Ranni by the ritual that killed Godwyn's soul, and notice that it is the counterpart to whatever mark Godwyn carries. Ranni's death was the complement to Godwyn's. Her body died. His soul died. They are the two halves of a single death split between two people, and both halves continue. Ranni continues as a soul without a body, housed in a doll, moving through the world in borrowed form. Godwyn continues as a body without a soul, spreading through the ground, moving through the world in a form that keeps growing. They are the divided remnants of a single act, and neither of them has arrived at whatever a completed death would have produced. The question of whether they are connected in their ongoing existence, whether the soul death and the body death that came from the same ritual maintain any relationship across the gap that was torn between them, is one of the case's most evocative open questions. Ranni seems aware of Godwyn's situation. She sends the player to retrieve her soul from Noxtella after its long preservation there. Her awareness of the consequences of what she set in motion is part of her character. Whether that awareness extends to a specific relationship with the ongoing condition of the body she helped produce is not established. Godwyn was described before his death as the most beloved of Marika's children, as someone whose character was genuinely admirable, as a warrior who pursued diplomacy rather than conquest when diplomacy was possible. The person he was is attested in the world around his body spreading, even as the body itself has become something unrecognizable. The death root does not look like Godwyn. The creatures it produces do not look like the beloved son of Marika. But they grew from him. Whatever is inside them came from him. The gap between who he was and what he has become is the specific shape of this case's discomfort, and it does not close regardless of how carefully the evidence is examined. He was the first to die. He was the death that broke the world. And he is still here, spread through the ground beneath everything, in a form that was never intended and has no name adequate to what it is, still somehow present in the world, his death unmade. One final thing about Godwyn before this chapter closes. There is a quality to his case that separates it from the others in this video, which is the quality of the irreversible. Most of the Lands Between's unsolved cases involve things that could, in principle, be resolved if the right information became available or the right action were taken. The frenzied flame could be released or permanently sealed. The gloam-eyed queen could conceivably be found if she was imprisoned rather than killed. The eternal cities are still there, underground, still producing evidence that could be studied. Godwyn cannot be made whole again. The soul death is permanent. The body continuation has been going on long enough and spread far enough that whatever Godwyn was cannot be recovered from what Godwyn is now. He is the only case in this video where the discomfort is not open in the way that allows for the possibility of resolution. He is simply the condition he is in, permanently and without remedy, spreading through the ground beneath a world that has spent years trying to understand what he has become. The memory of who he was is preserved in item descriptions and in the architecture of the life he lived. The body is in the ground, the soul is gone. And the two halves of his death are still running, each in its own direction, across a world that has never stopped being shaped by the first morning he failed to wake. Chapter 7. The Sealed God in Farum Azula, Crumbling Farum Azula, is a place outside the normal sequence of the world. It exists in a temporal state that is described in the game as unbound from time, which is a phrase precise enough to require careful unpacking. It does not mean the place has stopped in time, or that time moves differently there. It means the place was built in a period when time itself operated differently, and that it has retained the character of that period even as everything around it moved into the present. Farum Azula is a remnant of a different world, a world that existed before the current ordering of things, and it is shaped by the event it was built around, which is the preservation of something that was sealed there. What was sealed in Farum Azula is the bestial incantations, the ancient techniques of the dragons, and most importantly the Elden Beast itself in its role as the final vessel of the Elden Ring's physical form. But the case that has generated the most sustained uncertainty is not about any of these explicitly named things. It is about the presence in Farum Azula of evidence suggesting something else was there. Something that predates even the structures built to contain the known elements. Something that the current architecture of the place was built over or around without ever fully incorporating. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the storm that surrounds Farum Azula and notice that it is not described as a natural weather phenomenon. It is the permanent condition of a particular kind of conflict held in suspended state. A battle that was won long enough ago that the combatants are gone, but the energy of it has not dissipated. Farum Azula is surrounded by the aftermath of a very old fight. The question of what was being fought over, and by whom, is a question that the game's accessible evidence answers only partially. The dragons are the most commonly identified participants in whatever produced Farum Azula's current state. Ancient dragons are present throughout the ruins in both living and fossilized forms. The architectural style of the place incorporates dragon symbolism at every level, and the boss of the area, the beastman of Farum Azula, and ultimately Malekith, connects the ruins to the Golden Order's history in specific ways. But the dragon explanation for Farum Azula's origin does not account for the oldest strata of the architecture, the parts of the ruins that sit below the dragon-era construction and that are built in a style that has no clear analogy elsewhere in the game. One possible reading of the oldest architecture in Farum Azula is that it predates not only the dragons, but the concept of the Elden Ring itself. Some researchers have argued that the structures below the Dragon-era ruins were built during the First Age of the world, the period before the Greater Will arrived and imposed the current ordering of reality. This would make Farum Azula not simply old, but old in a specific and discontinuous sense. Old in the way that a layer of sediment is old, preserving the physical record of a world that no longer operates according to the same rules as the one above it. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the creatures that inhabit the lowest accessible parts of Farum Azula, and notice that they are not described in terms that connect them to the dragon tradition or to the beastman culture. They are described in terms that suggest they predate those traditions, that they were already there when the dragon-era structures were built over the top of them. They are the oldest residents of the oldest place in the game. What they are doing there, what they were there for originally, and whether they have any relationship to the sealed thing that the rest of the evidence suggests is present in the ruins, is not established. The sealed god thesis, as it has been developed in the research community, argues that Farum Azula was built around a containment project of larger scope than any of the named sealed things would account for. The storms, the timelessness, the multiple layers of architecture, the convergence of dragons and ancient beasts, and the Elden Beast itself all point toward a location that was understood to require the most elaborate containment infrastructure in the world. The question is what requires that much containment. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the remembrance of the blasphemous and the items associated with Rykard, the demigod who merged with the god-devouring serpent in Volcano Manor, and notice that the serpent is described in terms that place it in the same ancient tradition as Farum Azula's oldest inhabitants. The god-devouring serpent's tradition is the tradition of the old gods, the ones that predated the Greater Will's ordering, and Rykard's merger with it places him in relationship with a lineage that connects to Farum Azula's lowest strata. Whether this is a deliberate thematic link, or the product of a consistent visual and symbolic vocabulary used by the developers across multiple unrelated things, is a question the research has not settled. The disturbing quality of the Farum Azula case is specific to the feeling of scale it produces. Most of Elden Ring's mysteries are human-scaled in the sense that they involve people making decisions, and those decisions having consequences. Farum Azula's mystery, if the sealed god thesis is correct, involves something that operates at a scale where human decisions are at most the mechanism by which a much older situation expresses itself. Whatever is in Farum Azula was not put there by the demigods. The demigods came after. Whatever it is predates the ordering that the demigods inherited. They may not even know it is there in any meaningful sense. Another quiet detail appears when you look at Malekith's specific function in Farum Azula, and notice that he is not simply a guardian of the place, but a keeper of a specific thing, the Rune of Death, which was extracted from the Elden Ring and given to him for safekeeping. His role connects the place to the broader architecture of suppression that runs through the game's history. Malekith is in Farum Azula for reasons that are relatively well understood. What is less well understood is whether those reasons are the original reasons the place was built, or whether Malekith is a later addition to an infrastructure that was already there for older purposes. If Farum Azula was built for something older than Malekith's assignment, then the question of what that original purpose was is still open. The place is large. It is complex. It has the character of something engineered rather than simply discovered, which means it was built by someone for something, and the someone and the something predate everything currently identifiable in the ruins. The case rests on finding the original purpose beneath the layers of subsequent use, and the lowest layers are not accessible from any angle the research has yet found. The timelessness of Farum Azula is itself evidence of something. Timelessness in Elden Ring is not a casual description. It is a specific cosmological condition associated with the most fundamental operations of the world's ordering. That Farum Azula has been in this state long enough for it to be its defining characteristic suggests the event or condition that produced it happened at a depth of time that the game's other ancient events do not reach. The dragons are ancient. The founding of the Golden Order is ancient. Farum Azula is ancient in a different register, ancient in a way that those other ancientnesses are recent by comparison. Whatever is sealed in Farum Azula has been sealed long enough that the world was remade around it several times without disturbing the seal. That quality of permanence, combined with the elaborate architecture of containment, is the strongest indirect evidence for the sealed God thesis. You do not build this much for something small, and whatever it is still there in the timeless storm, in the ruins above the oldest ruins, waiting in the way that things wait when they have stopped noticing the passage of time, because the passage of time is no longer something that applies to them. Chapter 8. What the Fingers Do Not Say. The 2 fingers and 3 fingers are among the most unique figures in Elden Ring, because they communicate exclusively through a system of guidance called finger reading, and the game never shows you what is actually said. You are told that the 2 fingers communicate the greater will's guidance. You are told that this guidance shaped the formation of the Golden Order and the behaviour of the fingers' mortal intermediaries, the finger readers, and later the Tarnished. But the content of the guidance, the specific things said, and the specific instructions given is never rendered in the game in a form the player can access directly. This is a structural choice in how the game presents the greater will's influence, and it is a choice that has generated sustained debate about what it implies. If the 2 fingers communicated the greater will's guidance clearly and in detail, there would be a canon answer to most of the game's central cosmological questions. The fact that there is not suggests either that the guidance itself was ambiguous, that the intermediaries filtered it in ways that changed its meaning, or that the guidance was specific to contexts that no longer apply to the game's present moment. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the finger readers, the women who live near major sites of grace, to interpret the 2 fingers' communications, and notice that their interpretations are presented throughout the game as confident but not consistent. Different finger readers have different readings of the same situation. They do not disagree in obvious ways, but they emphasize different aspects of the guidance they claim to be interpreting. This is not evidence that the guidance was false. It is evidence that it was being filtered through individual interpreters who may have had their own interests, biases, or limitations. The gap between what the 2 fingers communicate and what the finger readers say they communicate is one of the case's most productive areas of research. The research is complicated by the fact that finger readers are not shown consulting the fingers in the player's presence. They offer their interpretations as established facts rather than as reports of an ongoing communication. Whether the interpretations they give reflect current communications from the fingers or accumulated tradition from earlier ones is not clear. One possible reading of this ambiguity is that the 2 fingers have not communicated substantively in a very long time. The shattering broke the Elden Ring, and presumably disrupted or changed the mechanism by which the greater will expressed its will through the fingers. What the finger readers are offering may be the residue of a communication that happened before the shattering, interpreted and reinterpreted through the intervening period, and by the time the player arrives, having accumulated enough traditional weight that it is delivered as settled guidance, even though the original source has been silent for a generation. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the two fingers themselves, when the player finds them beneath Lendel, and notices that they are explicitly described as withered and failing, in a state that suggests their function has been degraded by the same event that degraded everything else in the Golden Order's system. Withered fingers are not the optimal transmission mechanism for cosmic guidance. Whatever they are still communicating, if they are still communicating, is coming through a damaged channel. The guidance the finger readers offer may be the reverberation of a signal that peaked before the shattering and has been declining ever since. The case of what the fingers do not say becomes most interesting when you consider what it would mean for the entire structure of the Golden Order if the guidance that structured it was more limited, more ambiguous, or more long degraded than the institution built around it has ever acknowledged. The Golden Order presents itself as operating on divine instruction, on the direct and ongoing guidance of the greater will transmitted through the fingers. If the fingers have been damaged and the communication degraded or ceased, then the Golden Order has been operating on interpretation rather than instruction for a significant period of time, without acknowledging this change in the nature of its authority. This would not be unusual in the history of religious or political institutions. Organizations that build their authority on direct communication with a divine source tend to maintain that claim long after the direct communication has become interpretive tradition. The apparatus for claiming authority outlasts the mechanism that originally justified the claim. But in Elden Ring, the stakes of this shift are not merely political. The fate of the lands between, the nature of the next age, the content of the remade Elden Ring are all supposed to reflect the greater will's guidance. If that guidance is unavailable, the institutions claiming to transmit it are operating without the authorization they claim. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Elden Lord questline and notice that none of the possible endings of the game require the player to consult the two fingers about whether their chosen ending is the correct one. The fingers endorse certain paths through Enya, the finger reader, but they do not have veto power over the player's choices, and several of the game's endings proceed entirely without their input. This is either a gameplay concession to player agency or a theological statement about the limits of the finger's authority in the current post-shattering situation. The ending that most directly engages with the finger's limitation is the Frenzied Flame ending, where Melina specifically breaks her oath as the player's guide, and the three fingers supersede the two fingers' guidance entirely. This ending implies that the two fingers' guidance can be overridden, that it is not the only cosmic instruction available, and that the framework the fingers represent is one framework among possible others rather than the single authoritative channel through which cosmic will is expressed. This is a deeply destabilizing thing to have embedded in a game whose main quest structure is built around following the path the fingers point toward. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the broader history of how finger reading has been used throughout the game's timeline, and notice that the practice has a history of being used politically. Several item descriptions suggest that finger readers in the past provided guidance that served particular powerful figures' interests in ways that are difficult to explain purely as coincidental alignment with genuine cosmic will. The fingers communicated what powerful people needed them to communicate often enough to raise the question of whether the communication was being shaped by the intermediaries, or whether the greater will was genuinely convenient in the specific ways that its most powerful servants needed it to be. This is not a provable accusation. The evidence is circumstantial in the specific way that evidence of institutional corruption tends to be, made up of coincidences that accumulate into a pattern without any single piece being decisive. But the pattern is there, and it connects to the broader case of what the fingers do not say. The fingers may not say certain things because those things were never communicated, or because they were communicated and not transmitted, or because the damage sustained in the shattering obscured them, or because the institution that was supposed to transmit them had its own interests in how the transmission was shaped. All of these possibilities exist simultaneously, and the evidence cannot distinguish between them. The case of what the fingers do not say is in its deepest register, the case of whether the Golden Order was ever actually guided by divine will, or whether it was always an institution that used the claim of divine guidance to organize power in ways that served the institution. The two fingers are still there, withered, beneath the city. Whether they ever said what the finger readers claimed they said is a question the game leaves in the category of things you cannot answer from outside. Chapter 9. The True Cost of Grace. The Erdtree's grace is the sustaining force of the Golden Order, the light that touches those who are counted within its system and gives them the capacity for continuation. Tarnished are people who lost this grace, which is how they died and how they became the wanderers the game begins with. The restoration of grace is presented as the baseline aspiration of the main quest, the thing that a successful Elden Lord would provide. But the actual mechanics of how grace works, what it costs, and who pays for those costs is one of the game's most carefully obscured systems. Grace sustains. This is the Golden Order's central theological claim. What it does not say is what grace is made of. Item descriptions associated with the Erdtree and the Golden Order's theological foundations describe grace as the expression of the Elden Ring's bounty, the overflow of divine order into the world, in a form that individual beings can receive and use. This is a description that presents grace as a free resource, something the divine order produces without cost and distributes according to its own criteria. But elsewhere in the game's item descriptions, particularly in those associated with the dispossessed and the omen and the creatures excluded from grace, a different picture assembles itself. Another quiet detail appears when you look at what happens to people excluded from grace in the lands between, and notice that their exclusion is not neutral in the way that a lack of access to a resource is neutral. Their exclusion is active. They continue to age and die in the normal way. They suffer in ways that grace-protected beings do not. They are not simply missing something, they are being actively subjected to conditions that grace protects against, which means that grace is not simply an additive benefit, but is also a protection against default conditions that the world imposes on everything not included in the system. If grace protects against default conditions that the world imposes, then the world has default conditions. Those conditions are not grace. They are whatever the world imposes on beings that the Erdtree and the Golden Order have not extended their protection to. These default conditions include accelerated aging, certain kinds of death, certain kinds of suffering that grace-protected beings are sheltered from. The question of whether these default conditions are natural, in the sense of being a feature of reality that exists independently of any system, or whether they are produced by the Golden Order's system itself, as a way of making the value of inclusion legible through contrast with exclusion, is a question that several researchers have found deeply uncomfortable. The uncomfortable reading is that grace does not simply protect. It also generates the contrast that makes protection valuable. A world where everyone has grace is a world where grace is invisible. The visibility of grace, its social meaning, and its theological value depends on there being people who do not have it, who suffer for not having it, and whose suffering is legible to grace-protected beings as evidence of what they have. In this reading, the excluded are not the unfortunate exceptions to the Golden Order's bounty. They are a structural feature of how the Golden Order's bounty maintains its meaning. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Frenzied Flames followers and notice that they are disproportionately drawn from exactly the populations that Grace has excluded, and that their attraction to the frenzied flames' offer of undifferentiation is most legibly understood as the appeal of being released from a system in which their exclusion is a feature rather than a bug. The frenzied flame is not simply darkness in opposition to the Erdtree's light. It is the accumulated response of everyone the Erdtree's light has organised specifically to exclude. The case of the true cost of grace has a specific disturbing focus, which is the Erdtree's relationship to human life and death. The Erdtree accepts the dead. It absorbs souls. It is described as the destination of grace-protected beings after death. What happens inside the Erdtree is not described with the specificity that would allow the research to fully characterize what the Erdtree does with what it receives. But the scope of what it receives is enormous. Every person who has lived and died within the Golden Order's grace over a very long period of time has been absorbed by the Erdtree. The Erdtree is not simply a symbol of divine order. It is the largest repository of individual human experience in the lands between. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the golden seeds and the sacred tears that the player can use to upgrade their flasks, and notice that these items are the products of the Erdtree's growth, its seeds and its overflow. If the Erdtree is built partly from absorbed human souls, then its seeds and its overflow are partly made from what those souls contributed to it. The player's restoration and continuation through the game is partly powered by the processed remains of everyone who came before them and ended up in the tree. This is not presented as gruesome. It is presented as sacred. The sacredness and the gruesomeness are not separate things. The theological framing of the Erdtree consistently presents absorption into it as a continuation, a form of afterlife in which individual existence is preserved within the larger being of the tree. But the evidence for what actually happens inside the Erdtree is thin in a specific way. The game shows you what goes in. It does not show you what life inside is like. The claims about continuation are made by institutions that benefit from people accepting those claims. The actual experience of continuation within the Erdtree is not accessible from outside it. Another quiet detail appears when you look at what the Elden Ring boss fight actually involves, and notice that the Elden Beast, which is the Elden Ring in its physical form, is not outside the Erdtree, but inside it, encountered after the player has burned through the outer shell. This means the Elden Ring is inside the Erdtree, surrounded by what the Erdtree has accumulated, and the fight against it takes place in the space where the absorbed dead are kept. Whatever the Elden Beast is fighting for in that space, it is fighting for it inside a container built from everyone who has died within the Golden Order's grace. The final boss fight is inside the accumulated dead. The cost of grace may be that the people absorbed into the Erdtree have subsidized the continuation of the people who came after them. Their individual experiences, their specific identities, their memories and relationships, and the particular texture of their lives have been pooled into a resource that the Erdtree draws on to power its sustaining function. They have been dissolved into something larger in a way that preserves their contribution without preserving their individuality. This is not the frenzied flame's dissolution. It is a gentler and more structured version of the same operation, one wrapped in the language of continuation and afterlife, but arriving at a similar destination. The case of the true cost of grace is the case that most directly implicates the player throughout their experience of the game. Every time grace is used, every time a sight of grace restores the player, every time the Erdtree's sustaining power is drawn on, the question of what that power is made of is in the background. The game does not force this question on the player. It places the evidence in the item descriptions and the visual design and the architecture of the final encounter, and leaves the player to assemble it. Whether the assembling changes how the grace feels is something the game also does not say. That, too, it leaves to the person looking. Chapter 10. The Silence of the Greater Will. The Greater Will is the highest named power in Elden Ring's cosmological hierarchy, the entity whose will the Elden Ring is meant to express, and whose guidance the two fingers are meant to transmit. It is invoked throughout the game as the ultimate authority behind the Golden Order, and as the force that defines what counts as good and correct in the world of the lands between. And it is never present, it is never directly encountered, it never speaks. It exists in the game entirely as a claim made by other things. This is unusual even for an absent deity in a game with many absent deities. Elden Ring's other major powers, the outer gods, have physical representatives in the world. The Formless Mother acts through Mog and through the blood flame that spreads from him. The Scarlet Rot acts through Melina and through the plague she carries. The Moon acts through Ranni and through the lunar artifacts she pursues. These outer gods are absent in the sense that they are not physically present in the accessible game world, but their action in the world is specific and legible. The Greater Will's action in the world is diffuse and mediated. You can see its effects only through institutions that claim to act in its name. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Erd Tree, which is the most visible physical presence of the Greater Will's influence. And notice that it is described throughout the game as a foreign body in the lands between, something that came from outside the world and took root there. The Erd Tree is not native. It arrived. It brought the Greater Will's order with it. The world of the lands between was not always organised under the Golden Order. It was organised under the Greater Will only after the Erd Tree's arrival, which means the Greater Will's authority in this world is the authority of a newcomer. It has been here long enough to feel like the natural order of things. It is not. This matters enormously for how you read the game's cosmological conflicts. If the Golden Order is the order of a foreign power that colonised a world with its own prior order, then every force that opposes the Golden Order has a different moral valence than the game's dominant framing suggests. The ancient dragons are not simply proud primitives who failed to adapt. They are the prior order, displaced. The Nox who attempted to summon a different outer god were not simply transgressing against divine law. They were attempting to replace one foreign power's authority with another's, which is not categorically different from what the Greater Will itself did when the Erd Tree took root. Another quiet detail appears when you look at what the game provides as evidence for the Greater Will's actual intentions, and notice how thin the direct evidence is. The Greater Will's intentions are described only through what the fingers communicate, which is filtered through finger readers, which is structured by the institutions built around the communication. At no point does the game provide direct access to the Greater Will's perspective, its reasoning, its goals, or its nature. It exists at the farthest remove from direct access of any entity in the game. One possible reading of the Greater Will's silence is that it is intentional, that a deity of sufficient power and inscrutability does not communicate directly, because direct communication would be a diminishment. The silence is the statement. The Erd Tree's presence and the Elden Ring's structure are the communication. A message in the form of a world order rather than in the form of words or even actions. This reading is consistent with many theological traditions outside the game and is internally coherent as a position. It is also irrefutable from the available evidence, which is precisely its weakness as an argument. The more disturbing reading is that the Greater Will is silent because it is indifferent, not hostile, not absent in the sense of having withdrawn, indifferent in the sense that it established a system in the lands between and has not thought about it since. The Erd Tree is running on its own momentum. The two fingers are transmitting traditions that may have been set in motion a long time ago and have been running without active maintenance. The Golden Order is the organisational shell of a divine intention that may have moved on to other projects in other worlds before the shattering was a possibility on anyone's horizon. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the ending, where the player becomes Elden Lord under the guidance of the Two Fingers. And notice that the game describes this as restoring the Golden Order, without specifying that the Greater Will has reviewed or approved the restoration. The player becomes Elden Lord according to the criteria the Fingers have established, and the world presumably continues under the new Elden Lord's stewardship, and there is no confirmation from the Greater Will that this is what it wanted. The ending is complete in every formal sense. The Greater Will is never consulted. Whether this is because the Greater Will cannot be consulted, or because the Fingers' criteria are understood to be sufficient as a proxy for its will, or because the Greater Will is genuinely indifferent to the specific content of the outcome as long as the formal structure is maintained, is a question the ending does not answer. The game allows the player to restore the order the Greater Will established, without providing any evidence that the Greater Will cares how it was restored, or what the restorer intends to do with the position. The silence of the Greater Will is disturbing in the way that the absence of the expected confirmation is disturbing. The game builds an entire quest structure around proving yourself worthy of the Greater Will's endorsement, and then the endorsement never comes. The Fingers certify, the Erdtree blooms, or it does not. The world continues, but the entity whose will the entire enterprise was supposed to serve has never, in any accessible moment of the game's events, been shown to have an opinion about any of it. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Elden Beast's behaviour in its boss fight, and notice that it is not described as protecting the Greater Will. It is protecting the Elden Ring. The Elden Ring is the object through which the Greater Will's order is expressed, but it is distinct from the Greater Will itself. The Elden Beast is guarding an artifact, not a deity. Whether the Greater Will is accessible through the Elden Ring, or whether the Elden Ring is simply a device the Greater Will created and left running, is a distinction the game does not make clearly. The possibility that the Greater Will created the Elden Ring and the Erdtree and departed, leaving them to run according to the logic built into them, produces a world that is profoundly different from the one the Golden Order presents. The Golden Order presents itself as ongoing divine stewardship. If the steward left, the Order is autonomous tradition operating without current divine oversight. All the claims made about the Greater Will's ongoing will and guidance would be claims about something that has not been actively engaged in the situation for a very long time. This is the case that sits below all the other cases in this video, because it is the case that asks the most fundamental question about the world the game is set in. If the Greater Will is present and active, the Golden Order's claims have at least the possibility of validity. If the Greater Will is absent or indifferent, then every institution that claims its authority is operating on the credibility of a connection it may no longer have. The Fingers, the Erdtree, the Golden Order, the entire structure of divine sanction that gives the game's world its moral architecture, may be the echo of a relationship that ended before any of the events the player witnesses. The silence of the Greater Will is the silence that all the other cases in this video ultimately speak into. It is the silence that makes the unanswered questions unanswerable from inside the world. If the Greater Will were present and accessible, you could ask it. The fact that you cannot ask it means that every question about why things are the way they are, why certain people suffer, why certain forces were suppressed, why the Elden Ring was structured the way it was structured, has to be answered from inside a world built by something that may no longer be listening. That is the condition of the lands between. And it is the condition that this video's remaining cases inhabit. Chapter 11. What was Ranni's true goal? Ranni the Witch is the character with the most elaborately documented internal logic in Elden Ring, and she is also the character whose goal is most frequently mischaracterized. The surface reading of her questline is relatively accessible. She wants to claim the Rune of Death, break her connection to the Two Fingers and the Golden Order, travel to another world, and establish a new order independent of the Greater Will. This is what she says she wants. The question that has occupied the most sustained research is not whether she achieves this, but whether the goal as stated is the full picture of what she was working toward. The first place the research found traction was in the specific timing of Ranni's decisions. She killed Godwin's soul, sacrificing her own body to do it, at a moment in the game's timeline that precedes the shattering by what appears to be a significant period. This was not a reactive decision made in response to the events of the main game. It was a proactive decision made before those events, setting conditions in place that would shape everything that followed. The Ranni, who appears to the player at the beginning of her questline, has been working on her plan since before the world broke. The question of what she knew then that allowed her to plan with that degree of foresight is a question the game does not answer simply. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Cuckoo's Evergirl and the imprisonment of Blade. Ranni's shadow, who was bound there as a safety measure against the possibility that his loyalty to her would override his protection instinct, and noticed that Ranni anticipated his failure even as she relied on his service. She built the mechanism for containing the person she trusted most because she understood that her plan would eventually require doing things that his protective instincts would respond to in ways that could interfere. This is not the planning of someone who is improvising. This is the planning of someone who has modelled the entire sequence in advance. The researchers spent considerable time trying to identify what Ranni could have known, and how that would have given her the foresight to plan at that level of detail. The answer that has been most developed is that her connection to the Dark Moon, which predates the main game by an unspecified period, gave her access to a form of knowledge that the Golden Order's systems do not. The Dark Moon is described in the game's texts as a celestial body associated with the knowledge of ages and the perspective of something that looks at the world from very far away. Ranni's alignment with the Dark Moon may have given her a temporal perspective that other characters do not have, access to a view of the situation that included its future states. If Ranni could see forward in time, or see sideways across possible states of the situation, then her planning is coherent in a way that otherwise requires the implausible coincidence that every contingency she prepared for happened to come up. But it also raises a different question, which is whether a goal that someone has been working toward with foresight is really a goal in the same sense that a chosen aspiration is a goal. Whether Ranni chose her goal or was drawn toward it by foreknowledge is a distinction that the game's framing of her as an agent making choices sits uneasily with. Another quiet detail appears when you look at what Ranni proposes to do with the new age she is working to establish, and notice that it is described in terms of a fundamental change to the relationship between the world and divine power. She wants an age where divine power is more distant, where the world operates with greater autonomy from the oversight of entities like the Greater Will. This is framed as liberation, as the establishment of a new order that is more honest about the world's independence than the Golden Order has been. But the specific mechanisms by which this new order would work, and what it would mean for the people living under it, are not described with the concreteness that would allow evaluation. The disturbing possibility embedded in Ranni's goal is that the new age she is establishing is one where the world continues without the Golden Order's sustaining structure, without the Erdtree's grace, without the mechanisms that, whatever their costs, have been keeping the world functioning. Ranni's ending is one of the most positively framed in the game. It produces the most explicitly hopeful imagery. But hope imagery in Elden Ring is not a guarantee of good outcomes, and the specific content of what Ranni's new age would actually provide for the people who live in it is something the research has found elusive. Another quiet detail appears when you look at Ranni's description of her goal as the separation of herself from the Greater Will, and notice that this is also a description of the separation of everything she has influence over from the Greater Will. A personal liberation, if achieved, is also a change in the cosmic ordering of the situation she is part of. Ranni's goal is not simply her own freedom. It is a restructuring of the fundamental relationship between this world and the divine power that organized it. Whether the people living in that world were consulted about whether they wanted that restructuring is not addressed. The case of Rani's true goal connects to the broader question of whether the good ending, if there is one, requires something from the people who live in the lands between that they have not been asked to consent to. Every ending in Elden Ring remakes the world according to a vision that the Tarnished holds. Rani's vision is presented as the most thoughtful and the most explicitly aimed at something like genuine freedom. It is also a vision imposed on a world without the world's input, which is structurally identical to what the Greater Will did when the Erdtree first took root. The most generous reading of Rani is that she is breaking a cycle of imposed order by replacing it with something less organized, something that gives the world more room to find its own shape. The most skeptical reading is that she is a very intelligent person who has confused her liberation with the world's liberation, and who has been working for a very long time on a plan that reflects her values and her perspective, without accounting for what the people who are not Rani might need from the next age. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the item description for the Darkmoon Greatsword, the weapon that belongs to whoever holds the Darkmoon Ring that Rani spent her questline pursuing. And notice that it describes the weapon as belonging to an astrologer who left to find what lay beyond the night sky. The astrologer is the archetype that underlies Rani's entire tradition, someone who looked at the sky and wanted to know what was on the other side of it. The goal is not power, it is not survival, it is the answer to a question. Whether the answer, when it arrives at the cost of a world, is worth what it costs is the question this case leaves open. Rani is genuinely compelling, which is part of why her case is worth spending this much time with. She is not a villain. She is not simply an antagonist to the Golden Order. She is a person who suffered the cost of a system she did not choose to be born into, and who spent uncounted years engineering a path out of it. The fact that the path out runs through the entire world is something the game presents without condemning. You are invited to help her. The question of whether you should and what you are helping achieve when you do is not a question the ending resolves in either direction. The case of Rani's true goal rests, in the end, on the insufficiency of the available evidence for evaluating the long-term consequences of what she is doing. The goal is described. The plan is documented. The achievement is shown. What is not shown is the morning after the new age begins, and who wakes up in it, and what they find. The research has the outline of the action without the measure of its consequences. That incompleteness is not a failure of the research, it is the shape of a story that ends before it can be evaluated. Chapter 12. The Madness in the Mountaintops. The mountaintops of the giants carry a particular quality of desolation that separates them from the other high-altitude areas of the lands between. Farum Azula is strange and timeless. The Altus Plateau is elevated and golden. The mountaintops are simply cold and broken, and the coldness and the brokenness are the product of a specific historical event whose full details remain one of the game's most contested reconstructions. The giants were a people with a specific cosmological function. They kept the fell god's flame, the flame of ruin that the Elden Beast would eventually use to burn the Erdtree. This is the straightforward reading of their role. What is less straightforward is the question of why a people with this function existed, what the arrangement between them and the flame was, and why the flame was allowed to remain with a non-Golden Order people in a location that the Golden Order had to know about. One possible reading is that the giants were not simply keepers of the flame in a passive sense. They were in a relationship with the fell god, the fire giant deity, who is the source of the flame, that was more active than the word keeper suggests. They maintained the flame because the fell god required mortal vessels for its preservation, and the giants were the people best suited by their physiology and their relationship with extreme cold to be those vessels. This makes the giants less like a library that happened to hold a dangerous book, and more like a people whose entire existence was organized around a cosmological function they had been given, or had developed over a very long period. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Anastasia tarnished eater, who is an optional boss in multiple locations, and notice that she is specifically associated with both the fell god's flame and with a kind of madness that is described as distinct from the frenzy flame madness elsewhere in the game. The mountaintops have their own madness, localized to the region's specific history and distinct in character from the broader madness associated with the frenzied flame. This regional specificity suggests the madness is a product of something that happened in the mountaintops rather than a general condition spreading into the area. What happened in the mountaintops that produced this specific madness is where the case becomes genuinely difficult. The most accessible version of the history is that Queen Marika led a campaign against the giants, defeated them, and took their flame for the eventual burning of the Erd tree, which she had already decided would need to happen. This version is supported by enough item text to be the consensus foundation of the discussion. The contested part is what happened to the giants who survived, how the defeat was conducted, and what the mountaintops have been doing since then in the absence of the civilization that was their defining feature. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the surviving giants, the enormous fire-maintaining creatures still active in the mountaintops, and notice that they have not gone dormant in the absence of the civilization that organized their function. They continue to maintain flames. They continue to operate the specific behaviors associated with their role, even though the political and cultural structure those behaviors were embedded in has been destroyed. This is either the persistence of instinct, which would suggest the flame maintenance is biological rather than cultural, or it is the persistence of something more like institutional memory, which would suggest the function is still being served even though the institution is gone. The madness that pervades the mountaintops seems to be related to this persistence. The giants who remain are not simply animals following instinct. They have the quality of beings who are continuing to do something in a context that has made the doing of it meaningless. There is a category of suffering in Elden Ring associated with this condition, the condition of a thing that was made for a purpose, and that continues to enact its purpose after the purpose has been cancelled. The giants seem to embody this condition at scale, and the madness in the mountaintops is the regional expression of what that kind of suffering produces when it saturates a landscape. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Forge of the Giants at the peak of the mountaintops, and notice that it is not simply a physical structure, but a seal, a mechanism for keeping the fell god's flame contained and available simultaneously.